office of President of the United States.
For democracy belongs to us all.
A government for our tomorrows.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
We gather because we have chosen hope over fear.
Because this moment is your moment. It belongs to you.
Meet this moment as the United States of America.
Hello, and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Yasmeen Abutaleb, a White House reporter here at the Post. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by David Axelrod, former senior advisor to former President Barack Obama, who's joining us just one day after President Biden announced his monumental decision to step aside from the presidential race. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yasmeen, good to be with you.
I don't think this conversation could have been more timely, so I will jump right in. So we saw President Biden, within 30 minutes of his announcement, move to endorse his Vice President Kamala Harris. Since then, it seems most of the Democratic Party has rallied behind her. Today, just about an hour ago, we had former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi throw her weight behind Harris. So at this point, do you think there is any question as to who the nominee is going to be, or could a challenge still emerge to Harris?
I am absolutely convinced that that the vice president will be the nominee. I don't think that everyone who has been mentioned as a serious challenger has endorsed her now. Former Speaker Emerita Pelosi, who had been advocating more of an open convention format, has endorsed her. So I really don't think there's much mystery left. She is the candidate of the Democratic Party, and from what I can see, the party is, enthused about marching behind her.
So we did have some other notable figures, including Bill and Hillary Clinton, both endorse Harris. Your former boss, President Obama, has not yet endorsed her. In his statement, he had said something like there will be a process from which an excellent candidate will emerge. So do you have insight into why he hasn't yet endorsed Harris, or just knowing him, what you think his thinking might be on this?
Yeah, we should note former boss. I mean, he's my friend, and I, value that friendship, but I don't speak for him. But he has expressed in the past that he wants to play the role of someone who can pull elements of the party together if there is a competition. It seems pretty clear now that that competition is not going to emerge, and that the vice president's team has done and she have done an excellent job in these less than 24 hours. And really, I described it yesterday as a kind of shock and awe campaign. They've displayed their command of the moment, and they've backed anyone who is thinking about running out. And so, I expect that he will, he's a keen observer of events. I'm sure that he will read that as the process. I mean, this is part of the process too, right? She went out there. She said, "I want to earn this," and she went about the business of earning it by making the calls, doing the work, and unifying the party. So I don't think, as I said, there's any mystery now. Excuse me.
Do you think President Obama believes, and I also want to know your thoughts on this, that she right now is the strongest candidate to take on Donald Trump?
Well, first of all, she's the only candidate to take on Donald Trump. And I think there's an argument for why she would be a very strong candidate, starting with experience. Having been around presidential politics for a long time, I think the thing that people miss is just how difficult running for national office is. It's, it doesn't matter how proficient you are at the state level or in other walks of life. Running for president is a whole different experience. She's been in the deep end of the pool. No one else has. And while she may have gone under at times during the course of these last 5 years, she didn't have a successful campaign in 2020. Clearly she understands the demands of running for national office and for president. And she also has the advantage of having worked with the president for 3.5 years, having been in those meetings, having been in the Situation Room, having seen the job in a very integral way, and that's a tremendous advantage. And I think anyone who's observed her has seen her grow into this role. She's a uh, far different public personality and far different candidate than she was um, 4 years ago. So, there are a lot of there are a lot of talented people in the Democratic Party. None of them have been thrown into the deep end 4 months before a presidential election, and so I think that is a strong argument for her.
I want to hone in on what you brought up at the end because I think this has been a concern among many people that her 2019 run, she had to drop out before the Democratic primary even began. What do you think has made her better positioned to run a presidential race right now? And of course, I'll note the circumstances are very different. She will inherit President Biden's entire campaign operation, all of the money that he had already raised. We know there's been a flood of donations in just the 24 hours since he announced he was stepping down, and it became very clear she was most likely going to become the candidate. But what changes have you noticed, and do you think, and what do you think makes her more positioned or better positioned to run this race now than she was 4 years ago?
Well, look, operationally, there are assets around her that she didn't have 4 years ago. But I'm more interested in her own performance. What I see in her now is a much more comfortable candidate, a much more comfortable public official in her communications. She one of the things that happened in the past, and particularly in her campaign and in the early part of the administration, was she was a little bit uncertain in her communications. She was trying to find her footing. You don't see that anymore. She seems like a more confident candidate, a more commanding candidate, and that makes me feel like uh, she is she's up to the task now. Whereas you might not have said that 4 years ago. And listen, um, you know, of course, time will tell. She'll be tested in a really, they're already launching ads at her, and she'll have the full force of the Trump machine and the MAGA machine uh, uh, aimed at her from now to the end, and we'll see, how she parries that and gets back on offense and so on. But there is some value in having tried and failed. I mean, there are a lot of candidates who, Barack Obama lost a congressional primary by 30 points in Illinois before he got elected to the U.S. Senate and then got elected president. And he would tell you that you learn things from the negative experience as well as the positive ones. I imagine that she's taken some lessons away uh, from her previous campaign and from some of her struggles early in the administration. But clearly, she's a much more confident and commanding presence now than she was then.
A lot of the pressure for President Biden to drop out came from Democratic donors. And we have Michael Bloomberg, the former New York City mayor, and who is also, of course, a major Democratic Party donor. He so far has declined to endorse Harris and said the decision is too important to rush. We know that the vice president has raised $50 million in less than 24 hours after she entered the race. So, what is your read on where most major Democratic donors are in regard to her candidacy?
My sense is that they're more than anything, the thing that unifies Democrats now is a determination to want to defeat Trump, and the donors certainly feel that. I think that they basically went on strike because uh, as much affection and respect as they had for the president, they felt that he couldn't win the race and that there was no chance to win the race if he remained on the ballot. He's now stepped aside, which was an incredibly hard decision, I'm sure. But he's cleared the way, and now I think there's a general sense when I talk to people that of excitement and possibility. And yes, many of them had different ideas, you know, uh, about how this should proceed. Some of them may have had other candidates in mind, but all of them understand that she's a viable candidate who can win this election. And I think most of them are going to open up the spigot again. And I really don't think that uh, if she doesn't win this race, it's not going to be because she didn't have the resources. I think the resources will be there.
According to reporting from the Post, there were Democratic lawyers and operatives who had argued that elevating Harris to be the nominee was the easiest solution for the party, in large part because elevating her would prevent a lot of legal headaches because her name was already on the ballot and on paperwork that was filed with the Federal Election Commission. There are, of course, Republicans threatening to sue. We know Donald Trump's already calling this a coup. We know that he very much wanted to run against Joe Biden. But do Republicans have any legal standing to challenge this change at the top of the ticket? And how important do you think these challenges will be?
Well, look, the courts have surprised me lately, so and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to venture into those waters. But I will say this: I find it really ironic. I heard the Speaker of the House yesterday talking about what an abrogation of democracy it would be if Joe Biden were to leave the ticket, or as he said, to be forced off the ticket. Joe Biden left the ticket of his own volition. Um, you know, uh, these guys don't have really strong standing to talk about. Uh, he talked about, overriding the will of voters. That's kind of what the whole January 6th uh, thing was all about. I mean, it was an effort on the part of the president and his supporters to overturn the will of the people. I don't think they want to get into a long debate about whether the will of the people is being respected. Joe Biden has every right to step aside if he wants to step aside. I saw Trump was saying, well, Republicans should sue because they've had to expend all this money attacking Joe Biden, and now he's not running. Well, I don't know. That would be an interesting case to litigate. I know he's a litigious character, and maybe he wants to file that suit. I don't think he's going to get very far with that one, even with a friendly judge. So um, I really don't. They may, as a matter of nuisance, try and do that, but I have a hard time believing that courts are going to deprive the Democratic Party of its chosen nominee.
So I want to talk a little bit about the state of the race right now and what Harris needs to do over the next, I think we have 106 days. So we know from our own reporting and from others that President Biden in large part dropped out after his senior advisors brought him polling showing he did not have a path to victory anymore. In a Washington Post average of 11 post-debate polls, Trump edged out Harris by 1.5 percentage points, only slightly less than the 1.9-point lead over Biden in the same poll. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what Harris can do in this race that Biden couldn't. And I want to talk about vice presidential candidates, but before we even get to that, we would love to hear if you were advising Harris's campaign, what would you be telling them right now? What is the work that they need to do in the next couple of weeks?
Oh my, well, first of all, I think that they or their related organizations or the PACs uh, ought to be on the air right now because you don't want to cede weeks to Trump to define her without responding and going back on the attack. So I would fill that void very, very quickly if I were them. Secondly, I think as you make the vice presidential decision, as you make your strategic decisions, it's really a matter of math as much as anything else. National polls are important. Obviously, if a Democrat is trailing uh, a Republican in a national race, that doesn't bode well for the Electoral College either. But let's assume that she uh, bridges that gap um, and get back on top of that uh, equation. You have to focus on the states you need to win and get to 270 electoral votes. the path for Joe Biden was always through the northern industrial states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I think that's still the case. And so the question is, how do you frame a strategy and how do you choose a running mate who will help you win those states? I mean, that's the other thing I would tell them. And the third thing I would tell them is, you know, uh, one of the one of the challenges, or a couple of the challenges for President Biden, was that he wasn't in a position to really go on the attack uh, in a persistent way. Um, for a variety of reasons, and his particular state and condition was the focus of so much that you couldn't really bring Trump back into focus. They've got to quickly bring Trump back into focus. Donald Trump was enormously popular within the four, um, you know, parameters or perimeters, I should say, of that convention hall in Milwaukee last week. But he's not a terribly popular uh, candidate, and there are lots of concerns about him, some of which were exacerbated by his speech at the convention, which I've described as a grievance sandwich wrapped in a unity bun. And so I think I would think hard about how do I get back to him and to a very on the attack comparative campaign as quickly as possible.
So Harris does find herself in a little bit of a tricky position in that she is now effectively the Democratic nominee, but she is still serving as President Biden's vice president. So, how does she balance? Where does she need to define herself and maybe stake out a slightly different policy position than the president? Or is that something that she can't really do in this position? And where do you think it might suit her to stake out a clear policy position? I mean, for example, she's viewed as a much better messenger on abortion, which is a key issue for the Democrats. She's talked about Israel's war in Gaza differently than the president has. We know from her previous campaign, she sort of struggled to define where she was on an issue like healthcare. So where do you see sort of the key areas where she needs to define herself and make her positions clearly known?
Well, look, she's going to come under attack on some things, immigration being the first, and so having a clear position on that is going to be important. She has an interesting perspective on crime because she's spent her life as a prosecutor before she came to the U.S. Senate. I think that she needs to talk about, um, uh, the kinds of pocketbook issues that have motivated voters a lot in this campaign, and do it all in a comparative frame. Um, and don't make this race all about yourself. Take advantage of these issues and go on the offensive. And yes, of course, on abortion rights, that's still a highly motivational issue. She's she is the administration spokesperson on that. But let me just say something about separating herself out from the president. She is the candidate for president now. This is an election about the next 4 years. And while I don't think she should necessarily stake out places where she disagrees with him, she needs to articulate what she believes and where she would lead. And that ought to be her priority. Back in 2000, I'm sorry, 2000, I'm going way back in history before you were born, Yasmin, but I am old enough. I was young, but I remember the 1968 presidential campaign when Lyndon Johnson stepped aside. It wasn't clear that Hubert Humphrey, his vice president, would be the nominee until the Democratic convention in August. Um, and one of the challenges for him was to separate himself out from the president on the issue of Vietnam, and perhaps on some others. And ultimately he did it, and he had to do it. And so if there are places where she disagrees, um, I wouldn't walk away from that. She's running to be the next president of the United States, and people need to know where she would lead.
Well, we received close to 500 questions from viewers, many of which were about her potential vice presidential picks. So
Hmm.
we've heard a number of names being floated over the last couple weeks. We have Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper, Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, and then Arizona Senator Mark Kelly. So, what kind of candidate do you think would round out the Harris ticket? What sorts of qualities, maybe policy positions, geographic, should she be looking for in a vice president? And do you see anyone as the best option or someone who's not being discussed who should be discussed?
Look, all of those names have one thing in common is in that they're white men. They tend to be more moderate than she is perceived to be. Um, and uh, but the question I think that should guide them is who might give them the best chance to carry the states that they need to carry. And of course, Governor Shapiro is the governor of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is probably the most important state in this race. Both campaigns view it as a tipping state. So winning Pennsylvania would be very, very important. And in addition to that, he's uh, an excellent uh, communicator. He has shown an ability to reach beyond the kind of cosmopolitan base of the Democratic Party and into rural areas and small towns in Pennsylvania. He's very popular in that state, and he is, as is everyone on that list, I believe, a friend of the vice president. Three of them had served with her as attorney generals of their state. Um, so I guess it's attorneys general, but uh, so that's Shapiro. Kelly offers another set of assets. He's got a remarkable story: fighter pilot, uh, astronaut, uh, obviously the husband of Gabby Giffords, and everyone knows the tragedy they suffered and how they turned tragedy into action. He is a moderate. He has strong positions on the border. He coming from a border state. He's an expert on national security, and he's from a battleground state as well. So that would recommend him. Governor Bashir, I think, has really captured the imagination of a lot of Americans. Sadly, because his state has been beset by natural disasters and a shooting that got a lot of attention nationally, and his demeanor and his leadership in these moments of crisis um, has won him a lot of fans. Um, and the question is, it's the leap from that to uh, you know the middle of a presidential race in its final throes, and secondly, whether a candidate from the South is the best candidate to help carry the industrial North and those three states. And that's something they would have to calculate. But clearly, a great presence on TV, a very earnest guy, and who people respond positively to, who's won a red state twice, which tells you something about his political skills. And Governor Cooper has the same assets. He's won twice in a red state, um, and is sort of a center left center Democrat who would balance her off nicely. And you look at North Carolina, which has always been in that basket of sort of at least battleground adjacent states, that the states that might be uh, available to a Democratic candidate, and having him on the ticket might help there. The thing is, you don't want to sacrifice the northern industrial states for that because the math doesn't add up. So 270 is a number you got to keep in your mind as you make a lot of these decisions.
So, just shifting to the Republicans for a little bit, they responded to news of Biden dropping out by calling for him to resign as president. We've had the word coup thrown around. But I
Well,
think more,
they have some expertise on that. Yeah, anyway, go ahead.
yeah, it's a little bit rich. But what does Biden dropping out and the likelihood of Harris as the nominee mean for the Trump campaign and their strategy? We know they're reworking it to run against her, but how do they need to think their campaign? And is there criticism of Biden that can reasonably be applied to Harris, or do they need to sort of throw out the playbook and write an entirely new one?
Yeah. I mean, look, they're trying to link her in their initial advertising by suggesting that she is somehow culpable in a cover-up of his true condition. The truth is, you talk to anybody who deals with the president, and there are plenty of moments and times when he is functioning at a very high level and is making decisions at a very high level, and no one is really disputing that. So it's kind of it's, you know, but set that aside. Um, this is a bank shot, for them. I'm sure that they will push that issue. I'm sure she will have, an answer somewhat approximating the one I just gave you. In terms of him leaving office, it's really sort of a ridiculous position because you're not running for if you'd say I've decided that I should not be a candidate for the next 4 years. It doesn't mean that you can't fill out the next 5 months. And that's not what the president is saying. So, these are sort of political games. And I'm not sure how voters react to all of that. And, my advice to them about Biden is get over it. You built your whole campaign around one theme, which is that the world's out of control and Biden's not in command and he's weak and Trump's strong. Well, you don't have that race anymore. You may wish you had it, but you don't have it anymore. And so you have to recalculate and think about it. And they will try and, assign uh, some of the attacks that they've had on immigration and crime and, um, other issues to her. But they, and I think she'll be prepared for that, but that they should figure out how to deal with Kamala Harris. I don't think that they're going to win by trying to, assign concerns about Joe Biden's health to her.
Well, we have about 30 seconds left, so I just want to ask you quickly. There was a report today that some Trump advisors are regretting or second guessing the choice of JD Vance as vice president now that it's an entirely new race. I'm curious for your thoughts on Vance and whether he helps Trump expand the map at all or what he means now that we've got a completely different race.
Well, Vance was a luxury for the Republicans that they thought they could afford because they felt so confident about their position last week. I'm not sure if they knew they had this race, they would have picked him because they may not be able to rely on a depressed Democratic turnout and an elevated Republican turnout to win this race. So I understand their misgivings. There'll be a vice presidential debate, I assume, and we'll see how he holds up. He's a smart guy. I don't have any doubt about that, but he hasn't shown himself to be a great performer in his couple of interventions since he's been chosen. So, but it feels so early. It's been a week and they already have buyer's remorse. Um, that may be a record in presidential politics.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time, but this was a fascinating conversation. I'm so glad we had you here today. So, David Axelrod, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
And thank you. For more content like this, you can sign up for a Washington Post subscription. Visit washingtonpost.com/live for a free trial. I'm Yasmin Abu Talib. Thanks for joining us.